Here we go. So, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for thank you for joining the Collaborative Commons. Today's conversation is with Alexa Benson Valavanis, excuse me, who's the President and CEO of the North Valley Community Foundation. And today's topic is really about courage and community and collaboration through tragedy, more specifically around the Paradise Fire. And part of what motivated me to want to speak and reach out to Alexa to have this conversation is with everything happening down in Australia, I think there's a lot of communities impacted by it. And so in my heart, in knowing that we have friends down there, colleagues that I work with, what can they be made aware of in terms of the process of dealing with tragedies like massive fires, wiping out communities, wiping out wildlife, wiping out just what is normal. And so I know living in Butte County and doing the work with you, Alexa, has been always a pleasure. And the North Valley Community Foundation has really been kind of pioneering uncharted territory. So I'd like to turn it over to you and have you kind of share with us kind of the timeline of what was North Valley Community Foundation like before, because you did a lot of collaboration in the community there. What was it like the day of on November 8th for you? And then what's been the post-fire experience from in terms of leading recovery and really collaborating? Because there's been a windfall of resources that have come into our town, and you've been really the steward of those resources. So kind of want to hear your story. And again, if things come up for people, feel free to just ask questions and I'll convey them or relay them to Alexa. So Alexa, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. So of course, first I just wanted to share, as a humanitarian, it's been so difficult to witness what's happening there and not be able to just fly in and get on the ground and help. So our thoughts and our prayers are with all of you, and the devastation is just, it's heartbreaking. And I have to say, it's actually difficult for a lot of us here to watch because of what we've been through over the last 18 months in our own community. So there's a solidarity, unfortunately, because of this trauma that we feel with you. So just to kind of give a little bit of history on the Community Foundation and then quickly I'd like to move into how our experience might be of use there. About 15 years ago, I was hired to rebuild our Community Foundation, and I had the beautiful opportunity to kind of do a needs assessment in the region of what didn't exist and maybe what was needed. And we started to put together all those years ago relationships, essentially, that I think when I look back now, I can see that the relationships that we had been establishing for the past 15 years was essentially how we were able to transform overnight into a relief and recovery organization. But those products look like everything from starting nonprofits, incubating them at the Community Foundation, to convening local leaders and helping address really challenging issues in our community, from people experiencing homelessness and needing additional services to everything related to our environment, crime, care for seniors, children, et cetera. So the Community Foundation for the past 15 years has been dedicated to mobilizing citizens and community members to really effectively solve the problems that they had addressed in their own heart, that they wanted to look either to mobilize resources, friends, connections, et cetera, to really try and address. And it was a international foundation and has continued to be. So we have residents here that have projects in the south of India. We have residents here that are pioneering new hospitals in Pakistan. So this Community Foundation, although located in Chico, California, has really had an international footprint. So that's essentially what we have done. We've opened 500 unique funds with community members. Each of them have their own focus and purpose. And our Community Foundation, on the night of the day of the fire, which was November 8th, we had a staff of 5. So there were 5 of us here managing 500 unique funds addressing challenges in the world. We had, at that point, raised about $100 million for those collection of challenges and issues, and opportunities too, quite frankly, because as we have a model here that's akin to social entrepreneurship. So we did a lot of things where, a teenager walked in and said, I want to help stop the murder of orangutans in the rainforest, and she ended up selling used purses for things like that. So everything from what you would traditionally think of as primary philanthropic foundation behavior, from estate planning, plan giving, et cetera, to real grassroots mobilize a teenager to get something done in the world. On November 8th, everything changed for us. So in the past, when we got involved in international disasters or national disasters, man-made and natural, our role was to open up a fund and let our local community, the North State region of California, essentially make contributions into that fund, and then we would assess very quickly the local nonprofit on the ground or NGO on the ground that we could disperse those dollars to. So whether it was in Haiti, an earthquake in Pakistan, a shooting, God forbid, a shooting somewhere in the United States, we would raise money and then quickly deploy those resources to.
How do you deploy them? I mean, for example, I'm assuming as people are going to watch this, do you have connections already in Australia, for example? And who would you select to give the funds to? Because there is a big push with the Red Cross. And again, how do you determine where those funds are going to be going? Because it does take a lot of trust that the agencies that you connect with in these other parts of the world are going to deploy those resources, responsibly.
So statewide, we have a unique community of community foundations. So there are community foundations that really cover almost the entire geography of the United States. They're all independently run and unique with different focus areas, but there is a community foundation presence in most of the places stateside that we have deployed our resources to. Whether it was Harvey or Katrina, there was a local community foundation on the ground that we were able to quickly connect with, vet, and make sure that they would adequately disperse the monies that we had raised locally. A lot of these monies that I'm referring to are very modest. So something happens, and unfortunately sometimes these things happen multiple times a week, or a month, so funds would be collected and then we would immediately get them to the community foundation on the ground. If too many things happen at once, oftentimes we'll just do the vetting process for our local community and simply link up the recognized charities on the ground that we felt most comfortable with. So it would not even be collecting the money, but it would simply be connecting our local community members to organizations that we trust.
Yeah, I mean, because on that point, I know there's probably a lot of people looking at this situation and just feeling completely helpless. And the one thing they do feel that they can do is give something, give money. Sure. And so having it going to some place where it actually can make a difference, because there were some, people who were trying to take advantage of the tragedies as well. And so going to those reputable organizations like yours to have that vetting process done, gives me confidence that the money will be well spent and the people being affected will be well served. So I
don't know what the model is. If there's something akin to a community foundation on the continent there or in different jurisdictions, but community foundations are unique in that they're of a certain geographical footprint. So for ours in this region, we work with, let's say, 450 local nonprofit organizations here and know them. So one thing we didn't have to do on November 8th during the campfire was we didn't have to get to know anybody. We knew everybody on the ground. We had a scare with the second largest dam in the United States that potentially going to break the year prior. And we had 175,000 residents that were displaced, and the North Valley Community Foundation raised funds and made sure all shelters were fully funded to adequately care for those residents. Now, in that case, the dam didn't break, thank goodness, but we had basically a trial run for a mass migration of residents. None of us could have anticipated what happened with the essential death of a town overnight. But the point being is you have to find organizations that are embedded in a local region and can be trusted to know who's doing what and capacity. So we understood the capacity of the organizations. I will say that for as much information as we knew about the local footprint, NGOs and nonprofits, there were thousands of organizations arriving overnight that we needed to help, and we needed to help this region recover. And so we had to stay open to learning and building new relationships on the ground quickly. And so that's what we were doing in those early days, even though we were all impacted personally. So we were all evacuated. We were all experiencing the trauma ourselves. We were on the phone and building relationships with making sure the existing partnerships with nonprofits was in place. And within 3 days, we had funded all the shelters that were holding the residents.
Wow.
And all of that, now looking back, would be lessons learned. So for example, I had to physically sign checks. Now we have an ACH, an automatic transfer process, already set up with any NGO that we think we would need in the event of another crisis like that. So there won't be any paper checks needing to be signed. God forbid, if our foundation was in the burn scar, that wouldn't have even been possible, or if any of us were in a situation where we couldn't come in and sign checks. So some of those things, that's more of the triage crisis management piece, but I think more holistically or globally, I think it's about finding the organization that is one of the most trusted organizations that works with other charities. In our world, those are oftentimes community foundations, but any philanthropic entity typically would play that role because they are funding, they're the funding source for the service providers. We had, like in Australia, I think, not just a humanitarian, a human crisis, but we had animals at a much smaller scale. But we had lots of animals that were being displaced, and all of those charities had to be mobilized overnight in order to adequately care for 57,000 people.
Right. How did you, it seems to me like there is a kind of an evolution of a tragedy or a crisis like this, where in the very immediate after, or just the day that it started, is highly coordinated. And then to bring these other entities together that serve, for example, animals, and get them to actually work together when in the past they've been kind of their own entity within, let's say, under the umbrella of North Valley Humanity Foundation, to say, wow, you guys got to leverage your resources and really come together. I know it's a no-brainer. People probably said, yeah, no big deal. But I'm just curious to know, what sort of did you have to come up with some special operating agreements, or was it just, come together and let's share the funds equally? I mean, how did you kind of go about negotiating those new relationships or refined relationships based upon the need?
So a couple things. I'd put it, I think, in 3 different buckets. The first is within 3 hours, we had a fund opened at the Community Foundation where people could make contributions. And because of our existing presence on social media and some key relationships with local government entities, everybody was seeing this link on CNN and on our national news sources. So we quickly positioned ourselves to be the place where money could go, so that we could alleviate that stress from the region. We didn't understand the severity of the crisis, but we knew it was like nothing else we had witnessed. So we did the one thing that we do, which is we open up a fund so that we can raise money while it's happening, while it's on the hearts and minds of people. What happened because of the crisis, and I don't know where people are at there, but there isn't time for strategy in the early days. What you have to do is everybody needs to do what they do. So Red Cross needs to do what it does. Salvation Army does what it does. For-profit entities, families, open doors. Everybody stays in their best spot initially, because that's what we need. We don't want to be becoming something else in the middle of the crisis. So the foundation stuck in our lane. But one of the lanes that we had developed over the years was to incubate new projects. So everybody came here and said, within a few days, we need to gather and convene all the players. So that was naturally a role that we'd already played in the community. We ended up building what's called the Long-Term Recovery Group here at the Community Foundation, funding it, incubating it, letting it live under our umbrella. And many organizations, at least stateside in the United States, call those VOADs or COADs, or essentially it becomes the entity that all agencies and nonprofits participate in as kind of member organizations, so that there is communication. So you don't have duplication, and you don't have waste, and you don't have major gaps. when you have the federal government coming in and you have the state government in and you have the local agencies in, it gets very confusing of what the chain of command is and who's in charge of what. So it's very important that the organizations stay in their lanes, but communicate to each other what those lanes are and how far they go. At least that was our experience here. Then we can identify gaps. And the role of the Community Foundation was to quickly identify what was the government doing and not doing, and what were our local nonprofits, or what we call our safety net, what was it capable of addressing and what was it not capable of addressing. And unfortunately, those things have turned out to be massive when it comes to the campfire. What happened to our region, at least, is we have essentially the second poorest region in the state of California, the highest levels of everything, bad, let's just say, childhood experiences, ACE scores, from that to poverty, drug addiction, crime, et cetera. And so all of that was exposed in the fire. And our safety net that traditionally was able to help with certain populations and certain communities was overwhelmed by the demand overnight. And unfortunately, we have not had the support from our federal government that was so in order to adequately care. Are you there? Did I lose you?
No, I think we have a question. Let me just see here.
Okay.
He said, so Mark Jones, who's from Australia, says that's the issue now. There are so many funds and hundreds of organizations all channeling aid. It's very desperate and uncoordinated. So it seems to me that is, where'd you go, Alexa? Are you there?
I am.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, no worries.
So tell me, where's the money when you say that?
I'm gonna unmute Mark. So Mark,
yeah, okay.
You're on, brother. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Look, as you indicated, Scott, the major government agencies at a local government level, state and federal, are all contributing massive amounts of aid directly through funding and also whatever other needs are there. The Australian population, renowned for its gifting and support of its community in tragedy, there's hundreds of millions of dollars now being channeled towards the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, other key support agencies, wildlife agencies, homelessness, community care, aged care, and it's very disparate. There's got all this money. We're hearing about all this money, but no one really seems to know where it's going and how it's being coordinated and how, I guess, the responses are being prioritised. It's very reactionary at the moment, I guess is the term, but on my observation, it seems very reactionary because we're still in the midst of this too.
Right.
You're still burning.
Yeah, you're still in a crisis.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think in our experience, that's the natural course of events, that the charities that are on the ground and already have a presence there would make donations avail. In other words, they would be seeking donations for their behavior, their lane, what they're up to. So it's not a surprise to me that you have all this money coming into individual places. And in fact, what I would share from our example here is you need all those players. So you don't want you don't want just one place collecting donations per se, unless it was geographically possible that entity would know exactly what needed to happen. So here we have a single county, and it's just so vastly different, I think, from what you're experiencing there.
Yes, it's a very national issue here because we've got 3 or 4 different states that are impacted by the fires.
So the question is, so if you've got philanthropic dollars flowing in and you've got adequate NGOs on the ground collecting those and using those, then it's going to be more, I think, of the long term. Are those organizations positioning their strategies around long-term recovery? So what we were able to do, because we probably raised 25 million organically just because of our presence on the internet and with the trust and credibility of some key supporters. But about 75 million since then has been raised through partnerships and grants with private foundations. So that happened much later. The primary amount of money that came through was through leveraging and partnerships way after the flames were out. So you're in those early days where it's very natural for human beings to be finding the trusted charities. If they like Red Cross, if they like Salvation Army, if they like the wildlife organization, it's very natural that the money would just be flowing into those organizations. And then there has to be some way for those organizations to communicate about the long-term strategy. I don't know who would be best suited for that. That for us would not be our government organizations. That would be the nonprofit sector, and traditionally not a service provider. Traditionally somebody that's a little bit outside of it, like a community foundation or like a philanthropic foundation.
Right. I mean, the credibility that the North Valley Community Foundation brought to that process is that you guys became very transparent with what are the protocols in terms of how monies are going to be distributed. You know, it seemed like you guys created some ground rules in terms of this fire recovery, long-term fire recovery group, that there are some really cool governance to how you guys are operating. Because I think, to me, as I think of Australia, and you have multiple communities being impacted. I mean, take what we experienced in the campfire and multiply it by 50. I'm assuming, and each of these communities have their own set of needs. So it'll be really important for those communities to kind of find that neutral body to kind of help bring these different parties together. So I'm curious to know, what did you learn from the experience of bringing these folks together? Because it seems to me there was a shift in Butte County, and I think I don't know at what point, maybe you'll have a better idea, but where you went from coordinating efforts to really the collaborative efforts of recovery. What have you learned in that transition?
To speak to transparency, just there, we had a philosophy of radical transparency within the first day. I had asked the gentleman who ran our grant programs and our donation module to go ahead and post every single grant made as of the third day. So we, from the very beginning, and this was not a community foundation standard, we from the very beginning told everybody exactly every penny that was raised and where we were putting the money, where it was going, so that we could make sure that the community understood we had a 1% fee, which of course, now looking back, that was never going to adequately take care of things. But everything was completely transparent, radical transparency. And we demanded that from anybody that was crossing paths with us. So that was just something we immediately determined as a core value.
How did you go about ensuring that radical transparency was also being demonstrated by those folks who you're giving funding, who are coming to ask for funding? What were you looking for to have them demonstrate that?
So a couple things about the process. We had a process online very quickly where any organization that was helping people impacted by the campfire could request funds. And within that application process, there was a lot of information that we needed in order to vet the organization and also to understand how they were going to use the money. They didn't have to publicly be as transparent as us, but we needed to know so that we could be transparent. So we knew what they were going to be doing with the money, and we knew we were going to be able to hold them to that. When you are in the middle of a disaster like this, adding communications and marketing and adequate public relations is not a reasonable response. So we took the burden on making sure we understood where all the money was going to go and that we would follow up and report on that. And that's what we've done. So again, we kept amid a crisis like this, everybody does what they do well. What we do well is make grants. What we do well is vet organizations and help with the whole process. In terms of our long-term strategy, we knew, because the town of Paradise had crumbled, we knew that there was going to be a long-term recovery. And our mandate early on became to help the most vulnerable population. So it was not to rebuild Paradise, but to rather help make sure that the people that were hurting the most and the animals hurting the most got the care and support of the community foundation. So that was our mandate. We knew that we needed to build lots of partnerships in order to adequately represent those populations. So rather than using our board of directors, we built something called the Butte Strong Fund. And we brought in representatives from every single geography that experienced the burn. And we brought in experts that were trusted in those regions to join a committee. And they solely made the decisions about the grants made for our long-term recovery. We did build a framework, and I believe we used both Katrina and Harvey as models, but we looked at 5 key areas, and this is all available at the Butte Strong org website, buttestrongfund.org. And essentially we identified everything from economic recovery to children, education, et cetera. So early on, we knew that it was so severe that we were going to have to help in all areas in order for this community to recover. So within just a couple of days, we were funding childcare services because parents had lost their homes, the schools were all shut down, nobody had anywhere for the children to go. So we were mobilizing childcare. That quickly led into a $2 million grant to our district that underwrote every single counseling service available to every family, every child, and every teacher, because these teachers, 90% of the teachers in Paradise lost their homes, and now here they are going to be caring for our children who lost their homes. Everybody's in a very high state of trauma. So we focused on mental health, and that was the money trail for pretty much the first few months. And we were mobilizing any and all people, including the government, in order to adequately take care of those needs. Again, we were the central place in this community. That made sense. I built a team of superstars. So we went from 5 to 20
Wow.
much overnight in order to adequately be in every meeting, every conversation being had.
Right. So Mark has another question. So I'm going to unmute you, Mark. You're on, buddy.
Okay. Look, Alexi, you talked about bringing these organisations together and somewhat having a bit of a unified approach. I'm sure there must have been some collective vision that everyone bought into. And relationships, as we know, sustainable relationships, enduring relationships are built around a high level of trust. So what was the mechanism or the framework you employed or engaged in which to bring these people together, get that collective vision and those prioritisation tasks identified? And then I guess the next step is, what was the model for that ongoing professional development or resource development within that network, so that you're able to leverage the talent and the skills of all the stakeholders?
That's an interesting question. So from the first few weeks, we readily identified that we were not going to lead up the recovery work. So just to clarify, we are leading up the philanthropic role of recovery. So when we gather stakeholders early on, it's around what are they doing? And we are not setting and have not set the vision for overall recovery for the region. What we have done is set out our vision for funding streams for recovery efforts. In other words, those entities have to connect. And what the long-term recovery group was and is how that's done. So that group meets regularly, weekly, to ensure that case management, and we can get into case management because that's been a huge lesson learned, case management is being adequately tended to, housing, public safety, all of those areas have agents on the ground that need to be communicating adequately with each other. And the Community Foundation did not do that. What we did was we built the long-term recovery group, and it had its own unique leadership of just agencies and nonprofits, and they are still 18 months out developing what is their strategy and vision. That's really different than the North Valley Community Foundation and our vision for philanthropic recovery. Our mandate was to figure out what wasn't being done by the federal and state governments and what needed to be done to adequately care for the people here, and then make sure we aligned our funding to those things. And that's pretty simple to get people at the table when you say you have money available and you need them to show up, and you can set out the path, but we don't manage how they do it. We simply say, what is your idea for resolving this challenge? And then we hear it. So for example, winter was coming, we're 12 months from this thing, and we have people camping. And so people would come and say, we need propane tanks, we need shelters, and we need sheds built. So we aren't coming up with all those ideas. What we're doing still 18 months later is in a very response mode in some ways, listening to what organizations are doing and who are they collaborating with. And that can be done through a grant process. we mandate that they're deeply ingrained in a community. They can't just be one-off. So they have to show us through the grant process how they are collaborative, who are they partnered with, who in the local government knows them and trusts them to be making these projects come to fruition. So that's all done through our grant process. So the two things that are most critical, I think, is to have a vision and a strategy for long-term recovery from a philanthropic perspective, which we determined and we gave to the community. That wasn't done with charrettes or community gatherings. We determined in other communities what needed to happen for long-term recovery, and we came up with those categories, and then we came up with experts to help us make real-time decisions. The other thing is the long-term recovery group, and that's where you can unify and collaborate with the agencies and nonprofits that are actually doing the work, and that is a very difficult task. And they are going to have all sorts of challenges to working together in a crisis when they usually had challenges working together before a crisis. So those are two very different roles that the Community Foundation here has played. And I don't know the natural parties to do that in Australia, but it seems like you might need a long-term recovery group equivalent in each of your geographical footprints that can convene the local agencies. But you have to differentiate that from money. And the reason I'm underscoring those differences, if those two things become conflated, there's no clear path for visioning about long-term recovery. They're interrelated, but they're different groups. One is a funding group, and it needs to set its priorities based on the information and expertise of the people on the ground. Can't be disconnected. But those two things, the funding and the service providers, cannot be intertwined. That's where we get the collaboration. That's where we get the good stuff, is by keeping those things, I think, a little bit more separate.
Yeah, I mean, because you can see how as someone who believes in collaboration, it's like, how do you promote that shared interest? And there's a lot of shared interest, but when you start throwing money into the equation, self-interest comes to pop up sometimes and kind of almost erodes at that ability to kind of come together. Because when you think of the scope of the projects in Butte County specifically, there are people who have always been doing certain things, but are now being asked to come to the table and work differently, potentially. And I think
let me give an example of case management, because this I think will underscore a lot of those thoughts. So case management, disaster case management, something I wouldn't have even known those words prior to our fire. I understood social work and that we had community members that needed social work, but I did not know what case management was. And so when we were told by our federal government, FEMA, that they were bringing in case managers, we trusted that's what they do. They bring in people to find out who are the people in need, get them to fill out applications, and make sure that they have housing and care. And what we learned was FEMA, in this case, really provides a very small amount of case management. So early on, we had about 11 case managers. A case manager can have a workload of about 35 families, okay? And we have 27,000 people permanently displaced, many of whom are going to need what is considered case management. So one of the first things that the North Valley Community Foundation did, as soon as we assessed that FEMA was not going to adequately provide this care, was we convened any nonprofit organization regionally that had the capacity to do case management. So in other words, had they done social work for different parts of our community prior to the fire? If the answer was yes, we brought them to the table. And there was a case management, essentially a case management arm of the long-term recovery group that we could look at. So our Boys and Girls Club, our Jesus Center that works with people that are experiencing homelessness, our on and on and on. All the agencies that had that capability. And the Community Foundation, as the funder and as mental health and caring for survivors was our priority, we underwrote case managers in each of those institutions. So we built the model underneath it and made sure that each organization that could brought on a case manager to start adequately caring for their population of people that they already knew. And we're 18 months in, and the Community Foundation and our partners have as many case managers on the ground as our federal government. And it's not possible to adequately care for the thousands of people that are still on a list. So we're just now turning to our local government to say, this has always been a role for government. Government is not handling it adequately. And we now have a unified model and a unified group that can say, this is what we need our government to do. So not only did we build the case management system and then embed it into the nonprofits, but we then built a fund, a pool of money, millions and millions of dollars that those case managers could access and get the money directly to the survivors. So all of those case managers, including FEMA's case managers, are accessing a pool of funds that we place, the Community Foundation placed, in a neutral party so they can access those dollars. So that's the difference between mobilizing the actual project, case management, social work, and giving them access to money. So I don't know if that helps, but that's just an example.
Well, it keeps it, I mean, again, it's helping to create a system that is really about closing the gap between the needs and the resources and having those folks being able to do that. Because the scope of, when you think of, from, 11 people to do what you said, 27,000 people, that's just insane, right? So I'm just be curious, because it just seems like we're seeing more and more trends around tragedies like the fire in Butte County, what's happening down in Australia. Are there some things that you're starting to see that need to be happening on the ground now as a way to prepare for what we know now is not going to be a one and done? It's going to be a constant struggle, I think, for countries, communities, cities, governments, nonprofits, that we're going to be confronted with these kinds of tragedies more consistently. And I'm just curious, from your experience, what would be some of words of wisdom based upon what you guys have experienced in helping Butte County get past the campfire? I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah, so I wish I had talked to Mark and others before their fire started, because what I would have said is start a long-term recovery group now. These groups need to be meeting every single month. Your Red Cross, Salvation Army, groups that help the animals, groups, they all need to be meeting regularly to say, what are they doing? They don't have to be necessarily clear on the path to collaboration and focused on crisis or disasters, but they need to know each other and communicate regularly so that when the tragedy happens, they can be stood up. If that's in place, ours happened so quick because the Community Foundation existed. If that was in place before this fire, we would have been weeks ahead of where we are. So every group, every community, and you have to identify what's the adequate size of a community. In Australia, I have no idea. That might be a large geographical footprint, but the point is they need to have a think tank built with all the providers that's meeting regularly, even if it's Zoom. I mean, they don't have to physically be meeting.
Right.
They can determine what their crisis response would be and collaborative efforts. They could go through that process without the crisis, which would be ideal. The other thing is you need to have the neutral player, like a community foundation, identified. So within a few, maybe 6 months, we had the Red Cross here partnering with us, giving us their money because we were so good at getting the money to the survivors and to the organizations that even an entity that had been doing this for decades saw the value of working with the local organization that was neutral and could help everybody. So you need that. I think you need an organization that really isn't charged with one priority, but can look at the whole process. And that is the Community Foundation.
Well, as you say that being thoughtful of the crisis before it happens, because I think what I experienced and witnessed here in Butte County was the people who were providing services were they themselves experiencing trauma as well. So you had multiple layers of stress happening and trauma happening. And so we're not necessarily bringing our best selves to an issue when we're completely tapped out. And so that's the part for me where that, again, that ounce of prevention, right? When people say something like that will never happen. But again, you see what happened to tsunami in Japan, or, it's just, we're seeing more and more of this stuff. And I just think that what you guys have modeled and what you guys have done for Butte County has just been awesome. And it's been fun to see. And that's why I wanted you to share the story. Are there any other, besides the preparation and starting now, any other key insights or key principles that should be considered as these people do come together? Like what needs to be on their agenda?
Well, I think one of the things that that was so natural to us, that wasn't what we learned wasn't natural in the region, was the collaboration between government and non-government and private. And when you have something like the campfire, just the old rules don't apply anymore. So again, we were willing to underwrite anybody doing the work that we wanted done. And if that was a government entity, then that's who we underwrote, or that's who we funded. So we've put millions of dollars into local government entities. And that's just not traditionally how philanthropic dollars flow. And it really is something that I think came about because we had trusted parties within those government entities. So it wasn't like the nonprofit sector working with government. It was, Giovanni working with Casey, or,
Right.
We had those relationships intact where we could say, can you do this? We have 5,000 people at a shelter. We need to relocate them. Can you do this? And can you help us with this? So again, anything now that I'm sensitive to what's happening there, and that if somebody was giving me this advice amid our campfire, it's not useful.
Right.
In looking forward, if we can build any system prior to the crisis, what happens is during the crisis, we just adapt. It doesn't have to be built. And we had to build and adapt all along the process. And so if any other community, and I'm obviously communicating with lots of communities now, specifically in the United States, but in California in particular, we are encouraging them to build the systems for a long-term recovery group, to fund it so that you have full-time staff or part-time staff prior to the disaster, somebody that's charged with just convening these groups, not project-specific, just relationship building. The relationships are going to be what's most key moving forward. And there will be partnerships that disappoint, and there will be partnerships that excel. And what's important is the people that know each other in the room.
Yeah, and again, there's, I guess, on top of that, though, are there some key principles of getting to know, but what makes good partnerships, especially when they're planning for things that have yet to occur? How do we ensure that when the hammer drops, that they are ready to be mobilized? They're ready to kind of function in ways that they're not used to functioning. I think of the financial crisis, where when a city, started losing resources, they started changing the way they played the game. They did things differently. And so you guys have done some things very differently as a result of the need and the result that you're trying to hit. But are there any other key questions that you would be posing to communities and community leaders around helping them really get mentally prepared for, again, the things that you're not necessarily thinking about? Because you've taken on such a major crisis. And I remember how helpless I felt on November 8th. And my big number one priority was to go out and do something to be helpful. Sure. And your organization is that conduit for a lot of people, that they know they can go to you to contribute something, or you can embed them into a place where they can contribute.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point. Like during this process, we had 23 unique funds open up where it was just a community member saying, this is the thing I'm going to do. And we just lent our services to them. 23 new funds in the middle of a crisis is, amazing. So, again, I just want to encourage everybody to kind of do the thing that they do well. And what we want is collaboration, primarily through communication. So I don't know what collaboration means to you. I know you're like a school, you'll know all about what things could look like. But to me, adequately collaborating during a crisis is just communicating first, letting everybody know what's going on, not necessarily project or shared funding. And back to what makes it work or what makes it not work, I would just identify what is a natural outcome from the disaster. So way past the emergency response systems and adequate care for firefighters and resources for firefighters and all that, that's all relief, right? And our federal government here and our state government have really need to handle that, our local jurisdictions. But what we could figure out is the masses that we're going to need support, so housing and mental health. And any community that deals with a disaster, like what Australia is dealing with, is going to have housing and mental health as I would imagine, two of the top priorities. So it's not like we have to create or imagine or dream what the challenges are when humans are displaced. They need a place, the safety and security, food, water, and they need services for mental health, because those two things go hand in hand, right? If those were the two primary topics, I think, then you're going to have other areas, other organizations that really need to help with the fire safety and help with the evacuation routes and, all of that. But the community at large in the philanthropic world could really just start with, do we have adequate case management? If all our people are everywhere, how will we know who they are, where they are, if they were impacted by this? How do we vet that? You can imagine the type of fraudulent activity that has come to our region. So we can't even trust that if somebody says that they had a house there, it's not like we can just write them a check. I mean, a vetting process is required. That is case management. Unfortunately, money doesn't help people navigate the system in total. They also need care and support. They need to know what the resources are. So case management, I just cannot say enough. If you established a long-term recovery group and its only mandate was to make sure that there was case management in place for a disaster, that would put you years ahead of the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, as you're talking, one of the other ripple effects of this is a lot of people from the Paradise community basically became refugees and moved to other parts of the country and other states, for example. And it's been interesting because a lot of people moved up to Idaho, and a lot of people from Idaho are now, they weren't ready for the influx of refugees, for example. So you start to think about the systemic kind of the implications when all of a sudden, and I think of the refugees in Australia now, how many people were displaced and how many people had to be mobilized, and they're going to be moving into other people's communities that may not be having that plan, where other people that might be impacted.
Exactly.
So, there's so many moving parts to this. So again, how do we encourage our leaders to start thinking about, again, the unthinkable in a way that's going to be helping them deal with, I think, larger crises. So.
And I think that can really be broken into the two areas. One is, so the coastal regions of the world are going to be disproportionately impacted. And are we planning to just move population, or are we planning to start the process of dealing with climate change and dealing with the mitigation that's going to be required so people can live on our coasts? And that's fires, floods, et cetera. And then we have to decide, we have to come up with this as a nation and as a people in this world, how we're going to handle the mass migration of populations that are no longer in a hospitable place. Here, we had that happen. The homes were no longer, the place was no longer hospitable. The vast majority stayed in Butte County. So 20,000 of those residents landed in Chico, California. Chico, California did not have the safety net to deal with 20,000 people in need. So they weren't all poor, but they all had a new need based on this trauma. They needed a house, and we had zero housing stock, -1, zero housing stock. So these are the conversations that our leaders need to have. We do need here at stateside, at least, to have a much better federal response to disasters. But anything a local community can do to seed communication before the fire and differentiate between funding sources and service providers, so that you don't have the ugliness that can create, I think is going to be helpful, that everybody sees that we're in this together. We have to work together.
Yeah.
Neutral players can be helpful with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for you giving some of your time. And Mark, I want to kind of open it up for you to see if you have any other questions, because you're in the midst of it right now in Australia. So are there any other questions you might have for Alexa before we pull the plug on this conversation and kind of get it out to the community?
Look, a short answer, no. I have taken a bucket load of notes, so thank you, Alexa. Your insights have been quite amazing. Certainly challenged some of my thinking about some issues. I'd love to be able to connect with you directly via email or something if possible at some point,
anytime.
once we've digested this, and I'll put a few notes together, and I'm certainly going to direct the recording of this webinar to some very key stakeholders at a local government, state government, and potentially federal government level. So just to share the knowledge.
Sure. And on that note, Mark, there are some really good reports that North Valley Community Foundation has published that is on their site, which I think kind of describes your priority areas and the focus areas. And so there is some really good case studies that are published already on their site. So I'd encourage you to download those. You can go to it's nvcf.org. Is there what's the particular link, Alexa, for other people as well?
I think it's actually just on our homepage. We have
you have a series that they just scroll down. They can just pick and choose. There's two or three different reports that I saw the other day as I was perusing your site again. So
and we commissioned a safety net report. So we had outside people come in and say what's happening here, and those things again for proactive that might be helpful once there's a crisis.
On the environmental front, I am working with an environmental scientist who has figured out how to capture CO2 and convert it to a useful tool that will help the oceans and the air. So I'm going to be interviewing him probably next week or the week after, and we'll be pushing that out there as well. But an amazing scientist that has a solution that I think can help a lot of people very quickly. So really exciting, because I do think that the environmental thing for me, that's one of my focus this year, is to really kind of push it through the commons of what can we be doing as a commons to really help our environment, help our communities, help those that are in need. So what you brought to the table, Alexa, thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation. I love you, and
love you too.
Love what you bring to the community. So if there's no other questions, everybody, Alexa, so best way to reach you is just through North Valley Community Foundation?
Yeah.
All right. Again, thank you. Thank you, everybody, and we'll look forward to getting this up and on the website as quickly as we can. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, bye.
See ya. Bye-bye.